The galaxy had forgotten humanity. 600 years had passed since the last human ship was seen in Concord space, and in that time, the memory of Earth's children had faded into whispers and legends. The kind of stories that elder species told to frighten younger civilizations into obedience. Concord of 12 ruled the Orion Arm with absolute power, and they had decided long ago that humanity was too dangerous to exist freely. These young creatures from a small blue world had spread too quickly and fought too fiercely, and they had refused to bow before their betters. Ambassador Vela Sorn remembered the old stories well. Her grandmother had told them to her when she was just a hatchling. Tales of the strange bipedal creatures who had looked upon the greatest powers in the galaxy and shown no fear. They were mad, her grandmother had said, her scales rippling with unease. They would not submit, and they would not surrender. When the Concord gave them their ultimatum, they simply vanished into the dark between the stars. Vela had grown up believing these were just stories meant to teach young Kethri about the foolishness of defiance. Now she stood on a dead world at the edge of explored space, and she was beginning to understand that the stories had been true. The colony had been abandoned for centuries. Dust covered everything, and the buildings had crumbled under the weight of time. But Vela could still see the strange architecture that matched no known species. The doorways were too tall for Vorith, too narrow for the massive Threll, and the writing on the walls used symbols that existed in no Concord database. Her assistant, a young male named Chorus, called to her from across the ruined plaza. "Ambassador, I have found something." Vela crossed the broken ground carefully, her 4 legs picking their way through the debris. Corey stood before a metal pillar that still hummed with power after all these centuries, and lights blinked on its surface in patterns she did not recognize. "It is still functioning," Corey said, his voice filled with wonder and fear. "How is this possible after so long?" Vela studied the device with growing unease. Concord technology rarely lasted more than a few decades without maintenance. Yet this human machine had endured for 600 years in the harsh conditions of an abandoned world. She reached out with one clawed hand and touched the surface. The pillar came alive, light erupted from its core, and a figure appeared before them. It was a human, or at least the image of one. A tall creature with soft skin and strange forward-facing eyes that seemed to look directly into Vela's soul. The figure spoke, and its voice was calm and cold. "This message is for whoever finds this beacon. We are the last colonists of New Dawn, and we have received the order to evacuate. The exiled fleet has come for us, and we go now to join our brothers and sisters in the dark." Vela felt her heart's beating faster. "The exiled fleet was real. To those who drove us from our homes," the figure continued, "know that we do not forget. We do not forgive. We are patient, and we are many, and one day we will return to reclaim what was taken from us." The image flickered, and new words appeared in the air, burning with cold blue fire. "We remember. We are patient, and we are coming home." Then the beacon fell silent. Its centuries-long vigil finally completed. Vela stood frozen in the ruins, her mind racing with the implications of what she had witnessed. Humanity had not destroyed itself in civil war, as the Concord claimed, and they had not fled to another galaxy in defeat. They had planned their disappearance, organized it across hundreds of worlds, and vanished into the unexplored regions where no Concord ship dared to travel. They were still out there. "Ambassador," Corey's whispered, "what do we do with this information?" It was a dangerous question. The Concord did not like to be reminded of humanity, and those who spoke too loudly about the vanished species had a tendency to disappear themselves. The elder races had worked hard to erase humanity from history, and they would not appreciate having their efforts undone. But Vela was not like other ambassadors. She had always questioned the official stories, always wondered why the Concord was so desperate to make everyone forget about one small species from one small world now. She understood they were afraid the mightiest civilization in the galaxy. Rulers of 1,000 worlds, masters of technology beyond imagination. They were terrified of creatures they claimed to have defeated 6 centuries ago. "We report this to no one," Vela said finally. "Not until I understand what it means." She looked up at the alien stars, wondering which of those distant lights hid the human fleet. Were they watching even now, observing the Concorde's movements and waiting for the right moment to strike? The thought should have frightened her, but instead she felt something unexpected hope. The Concorde had ruled for too long. They had grown cruel and corrupt, treating the younger species as slaves and resources rather than equals. Perhaps the galaxy needed someone to challenge them, someone who refused to bow, someone who remembered what freedom meant. Vela gathered her equipment and prepared to leave the dead colony. She had much to think about and many secret archives to search. Somewhere in the forbidden records of the Concorde, there had to be more information about humanity's exile and their mysterious fleet. She did not know that her discovery would soon become irrelevant far across the galaxy. On a world that the Concorde had marked as forbidden, events were already in motion that would shape the foundations of civilization itself. A harvester fleet was descending upon 3 billion innocent souls, and in the darkness between the stars, ancient sensors were detecting the screams of the dying. The watchers in the void stirred from their long sleep cryo chambers that had preserved human soldiers for generations, began their awakening cycles, and a single word passed through hidden stations scattered across the galaxy. A word that humanity had waited 600 years to speak. Homecoming. As centuries of silence were about to end, and the galaxy would learn that some species do not fade quietly into history. Some species wait in the shadows, growing stronger with each passing year, nursing their grievances and sharpening their weapons. Humanity had been patient. Now their patience was at an end. Lord Ethos stood on the command bridge of his flagship and smiled at the world burning below. The Vorath were efficient harvesters, and this primitive planet offered abundant resources. 3 billion creatures lived on its surface. Creatures with soft skin and strange eyes that walked on 2 legs, and every single one of them would be processed before the fleet moved on to its next target. "Status report," he commanded, his massive frame turning toward his tactical officer. "Harvesting proceeding on schedule, my lord. We have collected approximately 400 million specimens from the northern continent, and resistance has been minimal. Their weapons cannot penetrate our shields." Ethos nodded with satisfaction. The primitives had tried to fight back with chemical projectile weapons and simple explosives, but Vorath technology was centuries beyond their understanding. It was like watching insects try to stop a wildfire. What of the Concorde prohibition on this world? His second officer asked nervously. "The old records say this planet is forbidden territory." Ethos waved a dismissive claw. "Those records are 600 years old. No one remembers why the prohibition exists, and the Concorde Council has ignored this region for generations. We are simply claiming unclaimed resources, and no one will question our right to do so." The second officer did not look convinced, but he knew better than to argue with Lord Ethos. The Vorath commander had built his reputation on ruthlessness and efficiency, and those who questioned his decisions rarely survived to question them twice down on the planet's surface. The harvesting continued. The creatures fled before the Vorath ground forces, screaming in a language that the translation systems could not identify. They carried their young in their arms and looked to the sky with desperate hope, waiting for salvation that would never come. One old female stood in the ruins of what had once been a great city. She wore strange garments covered in symbols that no living being could read, and she held a device that had been passed down through her family for countless generations. She did not know what the device was or what it did. Her ancestors had kept it safe and told their children to guard it always. And so she had done the same when the Vorith soldiers came for her. She pressed the only button on the device. Nothing seemed to happen, and the soldiers laughed as they dragged her away to the processing centers. But something had happened 50 light years away. Buried in the frozen core of a rogue planet that wandered the void between stars, a receiver detected the signal. Ancient computers stirred to life, analyzing the transmission and confirming what they had been waiting centuries to hear: a distress beacon. Specifically, a human distress beacon broadcasting on a frequency that only human technology could generate. Computers began their awakening protocols, sending activation signals to hidden stations scattered across 100 light years. Cryo chambers that had kept their occupants in frozen sleep for generations. Began the careful process of revival. Admiral Chun Wei opened his eyes for the first time in 50 years. The awakening process was never pleasant, but Chun had experienced it many times during his long vigil. He lay still while the medical systems flushed the preservation chemicals from his body, and he listened to the status report that played automatically in his chamber. Distress beacon detected from Seed Colony 7. Beacon type indicates imminent existential threat. Orbital sensors confirm presence of unknown hostile fleet in system. Estimated enemy strength, 300 vessels. Harvesting operations in progress. Chun felt his heart grow cold. Seed Colony 7. He remembered the evacuation orders 6 centuries ago, remembered the desperate scramble to save as many colonists as possible before the Concorde could find them. They had not been able to save everyone, and some colonies had been left behind with only a promise that humanity would return for them someday. The colonists on that world had waited 600 years for that promise to be fulfilled. Now someone was killing them. Chun rose from his chamber and walked through the awakening station, watching as thousands of his crew emerged from their long sleep. These were the soldiers of the exiled fleet, men and women who had volunteered to spend centuries in frozen slumber, waiting for the day when humanity would need them again. That day had come. Admiral on deck. Chun entered the command center, and every officer present snapped to attention. The main display showed the current status of the fleet, and Chun felt a surge of pride at what his people had accomplished during their long exile. The Concorde had expected humanity to fade away in the darkness, but instead they had grown stronger. Hidden shipyards had produced warships beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen, and human scientists had pushed the boundaries of physics itself in their quest for advantage. The flagship of the exiled fleet was ready. Send the awakening signal to all stations. Chun commanded. Priority Alpha. Operation Homecoming is now active. His communications officer looked up with tears in his eyes. Sir, we have waited so long for this moment. I know, Chun said, and his voice was heavy with centuries of patience and pain. Signal the Remember Carthage. She leads the first wave. The HSV Remember Carthage was the most powerful warship humanity had ever built. 4 kilometers of advanced armor and devastating weapons, crewed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for this mission. She had been waiting in the darkness for 600 years, and now she would announce humanity's return to a galaxy that had forgotten them. In the shipyard carved into the rogue planet's core, the great doors began to open. Light flooded into chambers that had known only darkness, and engines that had been cold for centuries roared back to life. The Remember Carthage moved forward, her running lights blazing like stars against the void. Captain Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge and watched the stars slide past. She was young by the standards of the exiled fleet, only 200 years old if you counted her time in cryosleep. But she had trained for this moment since childhood. Navigation. Plot a course for Seed Colony 7. Tactical. Begin weapons checks on all systems. Communications. Prepare the standard warning broadcast. Captain. Her first officer said quietly, Intelligence reports indicate over 300 enemy vessels in the system. We will be heavily outnumbered, Sarah smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Then we will make our introduction memorable. Humanity has been silent for 600 years, and when we speak again, we want the entire galaxy to hear us. The Remember Carthage accelerated toward the dimensional fold that would carry her across. 50 light years in an instant behind her, the exiled fleet continued its awakening. Ship after ship emerging from hidden bases that the Concord had never discovered. The humans had been patient and careful, building their strength in secret, while the galaxy forgot they existed now. Their patience was at an end. The Vareth had made a terrible mistake, and they were about to learn that some debts cannot be escaped. Humanity remembered everything, and humanity was coming home. The Vorith tactical officer was the first to see the anomaly. He had been monitoring the standard sensors, watching the harvesting operations continue on schedule, when a warning light began to flash on his console. Something strange was happening in the space, 3 light seconds from the planet. Something that his instruments could not identify. Lord Ethos, he called out, his voice uncertain. We have a spatial disturbance forming at the edge of the system. Ethos turned from the observation window with annoyance in his eyes. He did not like being interrupted when he was watching the harvest, and he especially did not like uncertainty in his officers. Explain, he demanded. I cannot, my lord. The readings do not match any known phenomenon in our databases. It appears to be some kind of dimensional fold, but the energy signatures are completely foreign. Ethos moved to the tactical station and studied the readings himself. The officer was correct, and the anomaly did not resemble anything in Concord records. Space itself seemed to be tearing open, and something was pushing through from the other side. All ships, defensive formation, he ordered, charge weapons and raise shields. We may have encountered a natural phenomenon, or we may have unexpected guests. Across the Vorith fleet, 300 warships moved into battle positions. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns, experienced hunters who had crushed every enemy they had ever faced. Whatever was coming through that hole in space, they would be ready for it. The anomaly reached its peak, and reality split apart. The HSV, Remember Carthage, emerged from the dimensional fold like a predator emerging from the shadows. 4 kilometers of angular black metal, covered in weapons that glowed with barely contained power. She moved with terrible grace, her engines burning with light that seemed to devour the darkness around her. Every sensor in the Vorith fleet screamed warnings at once. What is that thing? Ethos demanded, his confidence wavering for the first time. His tactical officer stared at his readings with growing horror. Unknown vessel class, my lord. Length approximately 4 kilometers. Power output exceeds our entire fleet combined. Weapon systems do not match any known technology. I have no tactical data on this design. Search the historical archives, Ethos commanded. There must be something. The officer worked frantically at his console, searching through records that stretched back thousands of years. Most of the results were empty, but one file came back with a partial match. A file that had been sealed by order of the Concord Council itself. My lord, the officer whispered. The energy signatures match a species that was supposedly extinct. The records identify them as human. Ethos felt his blood run cold. He had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories, but no one truly believed them. Humanity was a myth, a ghost story told to frighten young species into obedience. They had been gone for 600 years, and the Concord had assured everyone that they would never return. Now one of their ships hung in space before him, and it was larger and more powerful than anything he had ever seen. The Remember Carthage began to broadcast. This is the human stellar vessel, Remember Carthage, representing the exiled fleet of Sol. The voice was calm and cold, speaking in perfect Vorith, with no trace of emotion. It filled every speaker on every ship in the fleet, impossible to ignore or shut off. You are currently engaged in the genocide of human-descended populations. The inhabitants of this world are our children, the descendants of colonists we could not save when we were driven from our homes. 6 centuries ago, Ethos stared at the planet below with new understanding. These primitives, these soft-skinned creatures he had been harvesting like cattle, they were human. Somehow they had survived the great exodus, forgotten by their own people, left to develop in isolation until they know. Longer remembered where they came from, and now the humans had found them. You have 90 seconds to power down all weapons and surrender. Unconditionally, the voice continued. There will be no second warning. There will be no negotiation. Your 90 seconds begin now. For a moment, the entire Vorath fleet was silent. Then Lord Ethos began to laugh. 1 ship. He roared. They send 1 ship against 300, and they demand our surrender? These humans are as arrogant as the stories claimed. His confidence returned in a flood. Yes, the human vessel was large and impressive, but it was still just 1 ship. His fleet had crushed armadas before, and they would crush this lonely relic of a forgotten species. All ships. Target the intruder, Ethos commanded. Fire at will. 300 Vorath warships opened fire simultaneously. Plasma beams and kinetic projectiles and guided missiles streaked across the void, enough firepower to shatter a moon. They converged on the Remember Carthage in a storm of destruction that should have reduced any vessel to atoms. The human ship did not move. Ethos watched with satisfaction as his weapons struck the target, expecting to see the familiar flash of shields failing and hull breaching. Instead, he saw something that made his heart stop. The weapons had no effect. Plasma beams bent around the human ship as if deflected by an invisible hand. Kinetic projectiles struck its hull and shattered like glass against stone. Missiles detonated harmlessly against shields that did not even flicker under the assault. Remember, Carthage absorbed everything the Vorath fleet could throw at her, and she emerged without a scratch. Impossible, Ethos whispered. That is impossible. His tactical officer's voice was shaking. My lord, their defensive technology is beyond anything in our records. Our weapons are not penetrating their shields. We are not causing any damage at all. On the main display, a countdown timer appeared. The humans had broadcasted across all frequencies. Impossible to ignore. 30 seconds remained. Increase firepower. Ethos screamed. All ships, maximum assault. Destroy that thing. The Vorath fleet redoubled its efforts, pouring every weapon they had into the attack. The space around the Remember Carthage blazed with the fury of 300 warships. And still the human vessel waited, patient and unharmed. 20 seconds. Ethos felt fear creeping into his soul, a fear he had never known in all his years of conquest. He was looking at a predator beyond his understanding, a creature from the darkness that his people had never imagined. 10 seconds. My lord, his second officer pleaded, perhaps we should consider their terms. Perhaps we should? Never. Ethos roared. We do not surrender to ghosts and myths. Keep firing. 5 seconds. The Remember Carthage's weapons began to glow. 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Captain Sarah Okonkwo looked at her tactical display and saw that 90 seconds had passed. The Vorath had been given their chance, and they had chosen war. Time is up, she said calmly. All batteries, open fire. The Remember Carthage spoke, and her voice was thunder and lightning and the fury of a species that had waited 600 years for justice. The obliteration began. The first shots from the Remember Carthage were not beams of light or clouds of missiles. They were kinetic lances. Solid projectiles accelerated to 30% of light speed by magnetic rails that ran the entire length of the ship. They struck the Vorath fleet before anyone could react. 3 carriers vanished in the first second, their hulls torn apart by impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons. The projectiles punched through shields as if they did not exist, through armor as if it were paper, through reactor cores and crew compartments, and everything in between, Lord. Ethos watched in horror as the ships around him began to die, evasive maneuvers. He screamed, "All ships scatter formation!" But the Vorath were too slow, and the humans were too fast. The Remember Carthage's targeting systems tracked hundreds of vessels simultaneously, calculating trajectories and firing solutions with a speed that made Vorath computers look primitive by comparison. Kinetic lances continued to fire, and with each shot another ship was erased from existence. Then the secondary weapons came online. Directed energy beams swept across the fleet like the fingers of an angry god. They sliced through cruisers and destroyers without slowing, cutting ships in half and leaving the pieces to tumble through the void. The beams did not miss, and they did not stop, and they gave no mercy to their targets. Return fire. Ethos demanded, "Why are we not returning fire?" His tactical officer's voice was barely a whisper. "We are trying, my lord, but our weapons cannot lock onto the target. Their electronic warfare systems are overwhelming our sensors. We are firing blind." It was true. The Vorath ships were shooting wildly into space, their carefully aimed weapons scattered by jamming signals that turned their targeting computers into useless noise. They could see the human ship on visual displays, but their weapons could not find her, and still the slaughter continued. Drone swarms poured from the Remember Carthage's launch bays, thousands of small craft that moved with impossible speed and precision. Each drone carried weapons designed to penetrate Vorath armor, and they struck at weak points with surgical accuracy. Engines failed, life support systems collapsed, and ammunition magazines detonated inside their own ships. The Vorath fleet was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Lord Ethos made a decision born of pure terror. He ordered his flagship to flee, maximum acceleration. He commanded, "Plot a jump to Vorath space. We must warn the Concord." His navigation officer worked frantically at his console, calculating the dimensional fold that would carry them to safety. The engines roared as the flagship turned away from the battle, running from the human vessel with every bit of speed it could manage for a moment. Ethos thought he might escape. Then the Remember Carthage appeared directly in front of Hymettus, stared at the human ship in disbelief. It had crossed the distance between them instantaneously, moving through space in ways that violated everything he knew about physics. The Concord's fastest ships could not match such speed, and yet the humans treated it as routine. His flagship slammed into emergency reverse. But it was two late boarding craft launched from the Remember Carthage, small armored vessels that accelerated toward the Vorath flagship with terrible purpose. They struck the hull at multiple points simultaneously, earning through armor with cutting beams and forcing their way inside. Human marines poured into the ship. Lord Ethos had heard legends of human soldiers, but he had dismissed them as exaggeration and myth. Now he watched on his security displays as those legends became reality, and he understood that the stories had not been exaggerated at all. Marines wore powered armor that made them twice the size of normal humans. They moved through his corridors like ghosts, their weapons finding every Vorath soldier before the Vorath could even react. His guards fired their best weapons at point-blank range, and the humans simply walked through the barrage without slowing. They were not just soldiers. They were something else entirely, something forged in 6 centuries of exile and hardened by the memory of everything they had lost. Ethos tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door to his command bridge exploded inward, and a human marine stepped through the smoke. The soldier's armor was painted black with a single symbol on the chest, a burning blue torch that Ethos did not recognize. The marine's helmet retracted, revealing a face that was surprisingly ordinary. She was young, with dark skin and bright eyes that held no mercy and no fear. "Lord Ethos," she said, and her voice was calm despite the battle raging around them. "I am Sergeant Maya Chun of the HSV Remember Carthage. You are under arrest for crimes against humanity. You will be held for trial before our fleet's judicial authority. Do you understand these terms?" Ethis drew himself up to his full height, trying to project the authority he had once commanded. "You cannot do this," he said. "The Concord will destroy you for this attack. You are outnumbered and outmatched. Your one ship cannot stand against the might of 12 civilizations." Sergeant Chun smiled, and there was something terrifying in that smile. "One ship?" she said. "My lord, we only needed one ship for you." She gestured toward the observation window, and Ethis turned to look outside. The space around the planet was filled with new lights. Dimensional folds were opening everywhere, dozens of them, then hundreds, each one releasing another human vessel. They were smaller than the Remember Carthage, but there were so many of them. An endless stream of warships emerging from the darkness. The exiled fleet had arrived at this, counted ships until his mind could no longer process the numbers. Cruisers and destroyers and carriers and vessels he had no names for. Thousands of ships forming a wall of steel and fire around the planet he had tried to harvest behind them. Larger shapes began to emerge. Battleships to match the Remember Carthage, and beyond those, something even larger. Construction ships and colony vessels, and the entire infrastructure of a civilization that had survived for 600 years in hiding. "We have been patient," Sergeant Chun said. "We built our fleet in the darkness while your Concord thought we were dead. We watched and waited and prepared for this moment. And now we have come home." She raised her weapon and pointed it at Ethis. "The question, my lord, is what the galaxy will do now that humanity has returned. Will the Concord choose war, or will they choose wisdom?" Ethis looked at the fleet filling the sky, at the destruction of his 300 ships, at the single human soldier who had captured him without effort. He realized that the answer did not matter. Whatever the Concord chose, humanity would win. They had spent 6 centuries preparing for this conflict, and nothing in the galaxy could stand against them. Now the age of the Concord was ending. The age of humanity had begun. Sergeant Chun took Lord Ethis into custody, and the Remember Carthage turned her attention to the planet below. Shuttles launched toward the surface, carrying medicine and food, and the first contact teams, who would introduce themselves to the descendants of colonists who had been abandoned. 600 years ago, the human children had been found, and they would never be alone again above them. The exiled fleet stood watch, a silent promise that no one would ever threaten them again, and across the galaxy. The Concord of 12 received word of what had happened. Their reaction would determine the fate of all civilization. But humanity was ready for whatever came next. They had been ready for a very long time. The grand chamber of the Concord had not known such chaos in 1,000 years. 12 thrones arranged in a perfect circle, each one occupied by the supreme leader of the galaxy's mightiest civilizations. These were the beings who had shaped history for millennia, who had crushed empires and created nations, who had driven humanity into exile and erased them from the memory of lesser species. Now they argued like frightened children. "We must assemble the combined fleet immediately," roared the Thrall representative, his massive form trembling with rage. "These humans have destroyed a Vorath harvesting force. They have committed an act of war against a member of the Concord." With one ship, the Vorath delegate screamed, his claws scraping against his throne in fury. "One ship destroyed 300 of our finest vessels. What will we do when they send 1,000 ships? What will we do when they send 10,000? Ambassador Vela Sorn stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the chaos unfold. She had been summoned to provide her report on the human artifacts she had discovered, but her information seemed irrelevant now. The galaxy was learning about humanity's return through the destruction of an entire fleet, not through dusty relics on an abandoned world. The Concord's intelligence networks were overwhelmed with reports. Human vessels had been detected at the borders of every major power simultaneously, not attacking, simply waiting in the darkness, like predators studying their prey. "We should negotiate," suggested the Kethri elder, the leader of Vela's own species. "The humans have clearly achieved military superiority. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation that preserves the peace. Negotiate?" The Vorath delegate spun toward the Kethri with murder in his eyes. "They slaughtered our ships without mercy. They have taken Lord Ethis prisoner. And you suggest we negotiate with these monsters?" The chamber erupted in fresh argument, each species shouting over the others. Alliances fracturing and reforming as the representatives tried to decide what to do about an enemy they had thought safely extinct then. The lights went out. Every display in the grand chamber flickered and died. The elaborate security systems that protected the Concord's leaders fell silent. For a moment, the 12 most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in complete darkness. Vulnerable as they had never been before, a new image appeared on the central display. Was a human face, old and weathered, with lines carved by centuries of patience and burden. The eyes were calm but hard, the eyes of a soldier who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "I am Fleet Admiral Chen Wei," the figure said, "commander of the human exiled armada. I address the Concord of 12 directly, and I expect my words to be heard." The representatives fell silent, staring at the image with a mixture of fear and fascination. This was the first time in 6 centuries that a human had spoken to the Concord, and the weight of history pressed down upon everyone in the chamber. 600 years ago, "You gave my people a choice between submission and extinction. We chose neither. We chose survival, even if it meant abandoning everything we had built and fleeing into the darkness between your stars." Admiral Chun's expression did not change, but something terrible moved behind his eyes. "You believed we would fade away. You believed we would destroy ourselves with civil war. You erased us from your histories and taught the younger species that humanity was a myth, a warning, a ghost story to frighten the disobedient." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 600 years of exile. "You were wrong." The display shifted, showing images of the exiled fleet. Thousands of warships arranged in formations that stretched across light years. The largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Shipyards and colonies and research stations, all the infrastructure of a civilization that had not just survived its exile, but thrived. "We built our fleet in the places you were too afraid to explore. We hid our colonies in systems your sensors could not penetrate. We watched you from the shadows, learning your weaknesses, studying your tactics, waiting for the moment when we would return." More images appeared. Worlds covered in human cities, children playing in parks, scientists working in laboratories, soldiers training for battles they hoped would never come. The humans had not simply prepared for war. They had created an entirely new civilization in the darkness. The species you harvested at Seed Colony 7 were our children. Admiral Chun continued, "Descendants of colonists we could not save when we fled. They did not know us. They did not remember Earth. They had forgotten the stars their ancestors had crossed." His voice hardened, "But we remembered them. We have always remembered. Every seed colony we left behind, every world we could not evacuate, every human life lost because of your ultimatum. We remember all of it." The display changed again, showing Lord Ethis in a human holding cell. The once proud commander looked broken, his confidence shattered by the realization of what his actions had awakened. "This is Lord Ethis of the Vorath. He ordered the harvest of 3 billion human descendants. He ignored warnings that had stood for 6 centuries. He believed that the prohibition on that world was just an old story with no meaning." Admiral Chun's eyes found the Vorath delegate through the display, and the delegate shrank back in his throne. He was wrong as well. The image returned to Admiral Chun's face, Here are our terms, and they are not negotiable. The Concord of 12 will dissolve. The client species you have enslaved will be freed. The worlds you have conquered will be given their independence. And every leader who has committed crimes against humanity or its allied species will answer for those crimes. Before our judicial authority, the chamber erupted in outrage. But Admiral Chun continued as if he could not hear them. I will give you coordinates for a meeting in neutral space. You will send representatives with full authority to accept these terms. You will do this within 30 standard days. He leaned forward, and his eyes seemed to look directly at each leader in turn. Understand clearly what I am saying. This is not a declaration of war. War has been ongoing since the moment you drove us from our homes. This is an offer of peace, the only peace you will receive. If you refuse, or if you attempt to attack us, or if you harm any more human-descended populations anywhere in the galaxy, we will demonstrate what our fleet was actually designed to do. What you saw at Seed Colony 7 was a single ship giving a single warning. You do not want to see what happens when we stop warning and start punishing. The transmission ended, and the lights in the Grand Chamber returned to normal. The 12 leaders of the Concord stared at each other in the silence that followed. And for the first time in their long lives, they understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Vela Sorn watched them from her position at the edge of the room, and she felt no sympathy for their terror. These were the beings who had ruled the galaxy through fear and oppression, who had crushed anyone who dared to challenge their authority. Now they faced an enemy who had turned their own tactics against them. An enemy who had spent 6 centuries preparing for this moment. An enemy who remembered every crime and every injustice the Concord would accept the terms. Vela was certain of it. They had no choice, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The humans had returned, and they had brought judgment with them, somewhere beyond the walls of the Grand Chamber. Across the vast distances of space, the exiled fleet waited in the darkness, patient, prepared, and absolutely certain of victory. The centuries of silence were over. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy would never be the same, and in the darkness between the stars, Admiral Chin Wei allowed himself a small smile. His people had survived. They had endured, and now they had come home to claim their place among the stars. Earth's children had been scattered and lost and forgotten, but they had found each other again, and nothing in the universe would ever separate them. Again the message had been delivered. Now the future would begin.